Hello listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of The Cult Vault. I'm your speaker Casey, and today I have an extra special guest named Ron, an original member of the Gay Liberation Front, here to talk about his experiences following Guru Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh, along with his other notable life experiences. Before we jump in, I just want to take a minute to acknowledge the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. And although I don't understand entirely the monarchy in today's age, I know that this event holds significance for the UK and for history. May she rest in peace. Thank you to my newest patron, Sai. I am so happy to have you here supporting the show. I hope that you enjoy access to exclusive content and the community, and the knowledge that you make this weekly content possible along with the other sponsors and donors of the show. Now on to today's episode, with the hopes of speaking to this guest again in the future. Here is Ron. So hi Ron, and thank you so much for agreeing to come and chat with me today. We have a really interesting journey to explore with the listeners around your life experiences, and I'm really excited to get into things. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
So my name is Ron Auerbacher, and obviously the primary purpose of our discussion is to speak about what I call the Rajneesh movement, now called Osho. And at the same time, I can't speak about that without putting it in the greater historical context. What has personally happened to me through my family, fleeing Nazi Germany, how that impacted me in the 60s, the Vietnam War, having quite a bit of trauma and mental illness in my family, searching for what would relieve suffering, looking at all kinds of strategies and tools and methodologies, the Rajneesh movement being one of them.
Wow, there is so much in your life to explore, and I only want to go into things that you're comfortable speaking about.
I'm comfortable speaking about anything because there isn't anything I'm speaking to you about that many, many people aren't already aware of.
Really poignant moments in history. I feel like you've just kind of named a few there that are really pinnacle to your life and shaped how you are today. Would you say that it was the 70s that you became involved with the Rajneesh movement?
I first met them perhaps 1976, and I went India in 1977.
Oh, okay. So you did go over to the ashram in India.
I lived there for 5 years.
Would you be able to paint for the listeners your life and some key experiences that you had from your childhood leading up to the moment that you were introduced to the Rajneesh movement?
Well, I think we really have to go back to the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Being born in 1946, I was the child of people who had lived through the Great Depression and the Second World War and the emerging, American prosperity or imperialism. And my father's side of the family had experienced tremendous trauma. Everyone had to flee Nazi Germany in 1939. My father and relatives lived through Kristallnacht. My second cousin and her parents were in Theresienstadt concentration camp in Czechoslovakia. And my mother suffered significant mental illness. When I was 18, I suffered a significant emotional breakdown and was subsequently hospitalized for 3 years. Part of that was due to the trauma in my family. That's my explanation. Part of that was due to being gay at a time when it was completely unexpressed. I subsequently moved to New York, started to attend theater school at NYU by live theater, and was swept up in the alternative culture of the theater in New York, of LSD to the alternative therapies. I was a member for 2.5 years of the Gay Liberation Front, which was the activist organization that formed after the Stonewall riots in June of '69. I moved to California, where I really became much more immersed in all the alternative therapies, which were subsequently utilized by Rajneesh. Many people from the Esalen Institute brought them to India. I was still really looking for some significant relief from my emotional suffering. I lived in India for 5 years. I subsequently went back to St. Louis, where I grew up for a couple of years. I then moved to Oregon to Rajneeshpuram, which was documented in Wild Wild Country, all the criminality for a year and a half, and then came to San Diego, where I am currently, to study holistic health, body work, massage, Chinese medicine, nutrition. And the two biggest influences here were meeting people from a small Zen center, which had a very particular and I would say psychological and pragmatic way of practice, and meeting people who were teaching nonviolent communication, which has to do with, well, intra and interpersonal skills and awareness practices. I also, for the past 30 years, have rented a huge home, which now I have to leave, and had a lot of experience living with all kinds of differing people, and the challenges, which are all of our challenges. How do we work with other people to create a world which will work as well as possible? Clearly, this one isn't. Oh yeah, so what I mentioned to you before is, particularly given that the podcast is about oriented around the Rajneesh movement, did the Rajneesh movement teach me pragmatic skills to deal with huge amounts of emotional challenges, such as right now, aging, I'm 76, all kinds of things are starting to go wrong with my body, having to move from where I lived for 33 years, having my first and only marriage dissolve, having my father die, my brother die, friends die, friends with severe illnesses and challenges. And I would say, the simple answer is no. But we can also speak about how I want to acknowledge what attracted me to the Rajneesh movement in the first place, and what were some of the benefits for who I was at that moment in my life.
It's really important as well to get that perspective of both sides. Somebody positioned it to us at the International Cultic Studies Association, instead of saying what were good parts of the group, because some people don't feel comfortable answering that question after so much damage has been done. What attracted you to the group in the first place is, I feel, a much more approachable way to ask that question, and to also note, transferable skills that you might have adopted that you did take with you out of the group.
And I want to point out that thousands of people there, of course, people had extremely differing experiences. And I know there are currently people who believe that for them, the Rajneesh movement teachings and experiences were the highlight of their life. I would not say that for myself, but I recognize that that's true for others. It was, I joke, one way of finding out what doesn't work.
And still huge following around Osho and the movement at the moment as well. Very devout followers. Funnily enough, you emailed me the episode of A Little Bit Culty that featured Erin Robbins, and I got the chance to chat with her during a live stream I did last weekend. And we were speaking about how devout followers of the movement have all brigaded against her to send her awful correspondence regarding her speaking out.
So that would be an example. If, as I understand it now from my Zen practice, in Zen practice or in Buddhism, we say that the primary ways we hope to mature as human beings are through insight and compassion. And for me, people who would email her, threaten her, accuse her of speaking about something that's occurred to her and was genuine to her is not compassionate. And therefore is that, and this is supposed to be a religious, and I use religious in the best sense of the word, movement, but from a cult point of view, the inside and out, then we blame her. Not me personally. I think what she did was tremendously courageous and a gift to others who could hear. So how could a so-called religious, spiritual, whatever, movement engage in blaming, accusation, threatening. That is more of a cult behavior.
I think that's usually the response I use as well. Sometimes people will come to my YouTube channel in droves and start to leave negative comments and start to kind of justify some of the abuses that take place or abuses that have been covered up in certain groups. And my response is, and you're telling me that it's not a cult. So it's quite interesting to have those interactions. But of course, we still have to be sensitive and sympathetic to those individuals who have been through very systematic methods of coercion and undue influence. And it's important to remember that. Otherwise, we'll never break the cycle of judging individuals who are swept up into these groups, as we will explore with your story, Ron, around, the difficulties that you were having and the searching that you were doing that led you to the Rajneesh movement.
And that's like one of the primary, what has attracted me so much to the study of nonviolent communication, which is a worldwide system developed by Dr. Marshall Rosenberg, American psychologist, who's no longer alive, that I also have the responsibility to do my best to empathize and understand what would lead people to blame, accuse, as you were mentioning.
So you're born in 1946. What was America like in the parts that you grew up in?
So my experience, of course, I can't say what America was like because I was only either an infant or a child, but there was something intuitive in me that experienced my childhood as extremely unsatisfying. And it wasn't, above and beyond the trauma that both my parents had experienced. There was a sense somewhere that there was more to learn and more to life and something bigger than people making money. So I remember by high school when I saw Death of a Salesman saying the same thing. The tragedy in that play is of the salesman consumed by taking care of his family and being liked, and something resonated in addition to the lack of connection between father and son. So my mother and her side of the family had not been in Germany. However, my mother was extremely bright, apparently. Like unusually bright. And she wanted to go to Black Mountain College, which was an experimental college in North Carolina. It doesn't exist any longer, where some of the great artists like John Cage, Merce Cunningham, Arthur Penn, all kinds of visual artists, progressive and left-wing intellectuals taught. There's a book by Martin Duberman on Black Mountain College, and recently a large profile in the New York Times. And her parents absolutely forbid it. No, you're not going to this communist artistic college. And my mother, I can picture a photograph of my mother in the 50s looking absolutely forlorn with these children. And is this all there is to life, to be a housewife? When she would have been a natural social worker, and she always did volunteer work in what used to be called the inner city impoverished schools, and a natural compassion for people who didn't have as much financial security as she did. And so, my father would never have allowed her to work. And that was very common, to be a strong, independent person. And both my parents, she suffered from what's now called obsessive compulsive disorder, washing her hands huge amounts of the day. She also fell off a horse and had a head injury. But, to what degree the hand washing, the rages toward her children and my guess is it's some mixture of physiological, the head injury, the huge amount of frustration she must have felt, 1950s housewife, and, maybe genetic tendencies. No one can exactly say, and it wasn't common for women just to leave their husbands. Didn't do that. And I also can recognize now that my father's trauma and rages were a part of his family having lost everything. My grandparents had a department store in Germany, gone. I can remember once as a little boy playing with the little boy next door, and I guess his father had captured a Nazi trophy flag. So this might have been 1956. I might have been 10 years old, or 54 to 8 years old. And we were running around the backyard with this flag. He probably took it from his father's drawer. We didn't know. My father came out of the house and just flew into a rage and ripped up the flag, tossed it in the garbage can, but there was no explanation to us. And even I remember once when The Sound of Music was new, and my grandmother, who was British, used to take me to the theater, and I guess she couldn't go, and she gave the tickets to my father, and we went. So it was new. We had no idea what the story was, and my father was so, I might have been 14, 12, 14, I don't know, so upset at the end of that play, but he didn't share anything. I had no idea what was going on, but for him to go to a musical and see people, actors with Nazi uniforms on the stage was obviously tremendously upsetting.
Yeah, a lot of triggering symbolism in an era, I imagine, where firstly, men didn't really discuss their experiences throughout the World War. There was, still to this day, there's the man up mentality that a lot of masculine groups might adopt, and a certain way that men perhaps feel they have to conduct themselves. But back in the 1950s, I imagine, confusing for you, but also for your father as well, I imagine, trying to juggle all of that and not really be able to ask for any help.
Oh, absolutely. So it was always my mother's fault, my mother who should be in therapy. There was something wrong with her, rather than looking at, the whole family system. And speaking of the, culture of, you could say, patriarchy or masculinity, I recognized there was nothing about, homosexuality or being gay, nothing. But there was some recognition that I didn't fit in without having any words for it. And there's a picture of me at the senior prom in high school, in a tuxedo with this girl in a prom dress. And I looked so uncomfortable. It was awkward, uncomfortable to dance with her. I was old enough to drive, I remember, and I remember sitting in the car with her, and maybe from movies or something, I thought, well, I'm supposed to kiss her goodnight, and I didn't. And I thought, so there's something wrong with me. But I was, there was one of the more famous films of the 50s was Rebel Without a Cause with James Dean. And I recognized something that was exciting about that movie. He had I don't mean just that he was attractive, but that there was something about his rebelliousness from his parents, even if it was unskillful and lashing out and ended in death in the end. There was something very attractive about, very exciting when I saw the musical West Side Story. I relate to life through theater a lot. There's something more than suburban constricted life. And my best friend in high school had an uncle who turned him on to all kinds of books that were not the curriculum in our school. So by the end of high school, I had already read James Baldwin, Gore Vidal, who wrote about American imperialism, even in the 50s, James Baldwin writing about racism. None of this was discussed in the school, but I'm so grateful to my best friend from high school for widening my perspective, including that one book led to another. And Gore Vidal was one of the first authors to write gay men's novel called The City and the Pillar. And even though it basically portrayed homosexuals as really, suffering in the end with these constricted gay bars and whatnot, there was a beautiful love scene where the teenage boys go camping and make love out in the woods. And that was the first time, I was probably 11th or 12th grade, that something clicked. But of course it clicked in a way that, oh my God, there's something really wrong with me. So, yes, the stereotype that for many people, the 50s and early 60s, until the eruption of the Vietnam War and the music and Bob Dylan and the Rolling Stones disrupted that in an enormous way. The feminist movement, the civil rights movement. Oh, and that was a huge, and my mother always emphasized that we should be kind to Black people. And, we had a maid who did the laundry. My father was really irritated that she would treat this woman or a series of women as human beings and kind of be friends with them. From his point of view, based on what he had learned in Germany, they were just people there to do work.
Your mother sounds like she could have almost been one of those historical figures that people talk about today. Or she sounds almost like she shares similar characteristics with Ronit Plank's mum, who wrote the book When She Comes Back, about her mum leaving to go and join Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh because she was frustrated with being a housewife with the children, and the pressure was and the responsibility was too much. And so she left her children with the father and went to join.
She would have been much younger. I mean, and of course, there were independent women in, the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, but unfortunately that was not my mother, and she certainly would have been more fulfilled in other circumstances. Yeah, and part of that I'm sure was part of this obsessive compulsive hand washing and anorexia. And she also used to describe herself as a pacifist. I can remember sitting with these small black and white TVs and watching the civil rights demonstrations in the late 50s, early 60s. And I'm sure my father wasn't home. So she consciously and subconsciously, she really had a huge influence on there's a wider world.
Very progressive for the time, recognizing that she had the potential to do more than cook and clean and raise children in the age where women were expected to fulfill that role. And I read that people with higher levels of intelligence are more susceptible to severe bouts of ill mental health. So it kind of makes sense in that perspective from what you've said about the obsessive compulsive disorder and the anorexia. If she didn't have control over what she could do with her life in that time, she could have control over other things like what she was eating and putting into her body, I suppose. But this is all speculation because I never met your mother, even though she sounds like she was a force to be reckoned with. It kind of leads us nicely into talking about the 60s, where I'm sure there was even more media for you to consume that was not perhaps conventional by school standards.
Yeah, after I would say 1964, but I graduated from high school in 1964, and there was still, outside of the rare, as I said, the rare media, which was books, few plays, there was very little. I think in my last year of high school, the same best friend brought me the phonograph record, and we listened to A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, for example. This might lead into the next chapter. So I was starting to be aware of these things, and my great grandfather had gone to Yale on my mother's side of the family. He was the oldest living graduate. He was 103. I had no idea, I know I'm supposed to go to college, and I somehow, you didn't research on the internet, but somehow I found out there was a theater program there. I didn't realize that was a graduate program. So I went to Yale, and within 3 weeks I had a complete, what used to be called a nervous breakdown, which I would also call a spiritual breakdown. And I very, very quickly, I just couldn't study anymore. First of all, I think I had to share a room with another boy, and it made me very, very nervous because maybe I had stuffed that down in high school, like when I had to be in a locker room with other boys. So that made me very, very nervous. And Yale is surrounded, I don't know now, or was, by this black ghetto. And because of having read James Baldwin and also seeing the huge dichotomy in St. Louis, white people lived one place and black people lived another place. And this I would say there was a valid insight. I recognized here's this school surrounded by big stone walls, being prestigious, wealthy, and all I have to do is literally walk 5 minutes into these impoverished neighborhoods. And I started to do that because I couldn't read, I couldn't study. And I started to panic because I wasn't doing any schoolwork at all. And I wasn't afraid. I would just start wandering through these black neighborhoods, like for the first time in my life, what is this? And I mean, the disparity, the dichotomy couldn't have been more extreme. I just wouldn't show up for class. I had no one to talk to. My father told me I should go talk to a rabbi, and that. Oh, I had also seen, there was a very famous movie that came out 62, 63 called David and Lisa, about two teenagers meeting in a mental hospital. And I had a strong attraction to this movie. Something like this could happen to me. And I was in a panic because I wasn't going to class. All these tests, deadlines were coming up. I hadn't done anything. I mean, this was literally within the first 3 weeks of arriving. And my father told me to go talk to the rabbi, who just seemed oblivious. And then they told me to go talk to a psychiatrist. And I was so oblivious that I walked into this room. It could have been a psychologist, and it was a woman. And I remember saying, "Oh, you mean a woman can be a doctor or something?" I mean, that's how you could say isolated, innocent in the 50s. They were afraid I was going to kill myself. I didn't have a plan, but after walking around at night, I would just sit in this public park that was outside of the school in the dark. I was just frozen. I didn't know what to do or what was going to become of me, and I couldn't understand what purpose on earth. Was it just to study, make money, and get married? It was really a spiritual crisis as well. I think now there's a lot more counseling in these universities that's beneficial, but I just was frozen. I didn't know what to do. And so obviously this woman was afraid I was going to kill myself. My father came to New Haven, and he went in. I was in the waiting room. He talked to her. They asked me to come downstairs. There was a police car waiting. They put me in the back of a police car and took me to a locked hospital. I really started to panic because I'd never been locked up before. And the more I panicked, then they wanted to give me drugs, to which I had really bad physical reactions to, like shaking, and then they thought I was acting. And so soon I was just very drugged up and locked up. And this is really what happened over the rest of my life to my mother. Constantly in and out of therapy, hospitals, drugs, and really tragic, really tragic. Fortunately, after 3 months, because my family had money, they sent me to a private hospital in New England, where, to go back to Black Mountain College, Arthur Penn, the director most famously for Bonnie and Clyde, lived, and his wife was a therapist at this hospital. And they had a big emphasis on the arts. They had a young woman who had no professional training in the theater, but who had an intuitive ability for theater and to work with people. And she created a theater group with these mental patients, the excellence of which people came from all over Western Massachusetts to see. You couldn't get a ticket. I truly believe she saved my life, because I would say the therapy at that time was very, very primitive. There was no skill building as there is in like cognitive therapy now. It was still very Freudian. There was something, the therapist wouldn't say much. I would talk and talk and talk. And it was hugely shameful to admit any same-sex attraction. No one told me. I mean, it was that because that was a psychiatric diagnosis at the time.
I was going to ask if that was the reason that you were sent to a locked facility, because you had decided to speak out about your same-sex attraction.
It was probably a combo plate, I mean, I would say from their point of view, this young man is paralyzed. He can't study. He can't function at Yale. Doesn't appear that he could work, take a job, go home to his parents, where the family atmosphere is so chaotic. I would say it was a part, but not all.
Right. So when you're in the facility and you're having these sessions with the psychiatrist, are you opening up about those feelings that you've been having and speaking to somebody about them for the first time?
Little bit, but there was no compassion. It would take me 20 minutes to say, like, "Oh, I think I'm attracted to other boys." No, just write it down, and I'm laughing because so I remember I was in a play, I mean, we did, as I mentioned, one play after another, and that was the best therapy because it gave me community and friendship and creativity, activity, and a purpose in life. And it was a romantic comedy in verse called The Lady's Not for Burning. And I was supposed to kiss the girl. And the director said, "No, Ronnie, just kiss her the way you kiss a girl." She had no idea.
Oh gosh.
We laughed about it later for years. But and this is, my other friends from the Gay Liberation Front. This was not necessarily their experience as teenagers, and it just really seemed to depend on some combination of our conditioning and our innate personality.
I love how you talk about the theatre and the arts. I think that's incredible how you speak about that. And everybody that listens to the show will know that I'm just a huge advocate for arts and having some type of creative outlet. I think it's so incredibly important to every individual's well-being. But the way you speak about it, it just reminds me of how I felt when I was growing up and being involved in the arts. And I can see why you and Nicola are such good friends as well.
Jump about 30, 35 years ahead. In the late 90s, I wrote a play the purpose of which was, after interviewing both my parents, to understand through a therapy where we had to journal about our parents, to understand their reality from inside their point of view. And doing that, playing my mother who had this brilliance and obsessive compulsive, playing my father who had the flee Nazi Germany and have everything taken away, and then performing in public the story I just told you about Yale and this breakdown was so beneficial for me to have empathy for my parents and myself. And yeah, so I agree with you. I'm a huge believer in but I would say it's not sufficient. It's wonderful and it's not sufficient.
So after 3 years, what was it that made the psychiatrist or the team sign you off in the end so that you didn't attend that therapy anymore?
Well, I did, but in New York. So they thought I was relatively functional and I could go to theater school, which I did, and I could function there.
Right.
But I wasn't internally any less miserable or depressed. I still hadn't resolved anything about my homosexuality, word we used at the time, or how to have deepening relationships with other people outside of the arts, which is sort of a pretend. So I would continue to see a conventional Freudian psychiatrist in New York, and it's just, you talk, it's like complaining and someone sits there and then it's over. But there's no, from my point of view, there are so many more tools available these days for, personal growth and maturation than I knew existed at that time. And also because I quickly gravitated toward the experimental theater in New York, which was a reflection of everything, the Vietnam War, the racism, treatment of women, the emerging sexuality, because the pill had been developed, for example, that I became so dissatisfied with this school, which was basically training me to do 50s conventional, death of a salesman type. And I saw well, you might have to be a theater buff to know, but these theaters such as the Open Theater, the Living Theater, Richard Schecter's Performance Group, and other just blew apart the theater in New York in ways that it was completely different and very much a product of the overall culture. I was then miserable just going through a conventional theater training, although in between semesters in the summer of 1968, when there were all these, what at the time were called race riots all over America after the assassination of Dr. King and Robert Kennedy and Malcolm X, the city of New York actually paid a group of us to do street theater in New York City on the subject of racism, to do theater that would engage passersby and get them to talk to each other about racism. And now that was interesting to me, and way more interesting than what I was doing in school. In the summer of 1969, exactly at the same time, actually, that the Stonewall riots were occurring in New York, because I'd heard about the, Summer of Love and the hippies in San Francisco, I and another actor went to California. I had read On the Road by Jack Kerouac, in which, for whatever the sexism of that book, the part that inspired me was the fact that you could travel, see other cultures, meet people that you would never have met before, sort of get out of the box. And I went to, because there was a chapter in there about him picking fruit. And I went to Stockton, which lived with a Mexican family, and got up at 4 a.m. and started picking apricots just to see something that was outside of this middle-class suburban upbringing that I had had.
So you were in California in 1969, which is when the Manson family were active. So that's really interesting that you just traveled to that part of America when all of that was happening as well.
If you read popular magazines, that was where there was something significant happening, more than in New York. I also want to say that the other huge influence in New York was the anti-war movement. There was a huge demonstration in Washington around the Pentagon. I think it was 1967. Norman Mailer wrote a book about it called Armies of the Night, where tens of thousands of people surrounded the Pentagon in a circle. The idea was we would levitate the Pentagon and stop the Vietnam War. But there was the fact that the racism, the imperialism, the war opened up all kinds of questions about, of course, Dr. King's murder. What kind of world and society do we want to see? I, quote, accidentally ended up on a beach north of San Francisco with a bunch of hippies and took my first acid trip. And I recognized, no, I can't do another year of theater school. It's boring. It's not nearly as exciting as the experimental theater I was seeing. And I had no idea what I was going to do, but I went back to New York and quit. I got a job scooping ice cream on the night shift in Greenwich Village. And then, of course, I was seeing lots of artistic, and I was already living in the village.
And because Greenwich Village is where the Stonewall pub was located, is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Wow. So you were really like in the heart of activism at that point.
I was already living there, but I'd only been going like almost 10, 12 hours a day to theater school. So I had no idea what I was going to do. I was walking through a small park in the East Village. And I saw a flyer that said there was a student group that was going to Cuba to learn about the Cuban Revolution. I had a friend, one of my friends in high school joined the Peace Corps, and he went briefly to Cuba. And I remember talking to him about it. And now we've learned a lot more at the time, but at the time it seemed like, wow, you could organize a society in a different way where people's needs would be taken care of, medical needs, like almost, it's a very tiny island, of course, but almost the entire country was taught to read. They had medical care. And of course, we only saw the best parts of the Cuban. So I signed up for that. We only saw the best parts of the Cuban Revolution, the new farms, the new factories that had been built with Russian money.
It's just everything that paints like Fidel Castro in the best light possible.
But I also was aware that Europe, I mean, there had been a full page ad, I think, in the New York Times that Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone Beauvoir, other European intellectuals had taken out condemning Castro's concentration camps and the jailing of political prisoners and homosexuals and artists. I was there. So now, once again, I'm living in this big army tent with a lot of other young men. I was not having resolved in any way my same-sex attraction. I was extremely uncomfortable. I was also very ashamed because there were young men there from the Weathermen, which was the organization that advocated violence to stop the Vietnam War. So there again, I thought, well, I'm not a real man. I don't have the courage to run through the street with baseball bats and smash car windows because that'll stop the Vietnam War, or make bombs. And I mean, there was a lot of pressure that was the only way. Now, so I met, it turned out there were a fair number, I mean, not fair, 3, 4, 5, 6 people on that, we called it a brigade, that eventually became members of the Gay Liberation Front. We came back from Cuba, and this one guy, his name is Jason Serenas, he was just actually, he just wrote me, he was appointed to the governor's board in Oregon, in Washington State, to advocate for the needs of gay seniors in the state of Washington. And he's been an activist his whole life. I guess he called me up or wrote me a letter, and he said, I want to come. He was in New Haven, and he called me up and said, I want to come see you in New York. And he came down. This was after the trip, of course. It was a 2-month trip. And he said, did you read about those Stonewall riots? And, well, there was this organization that formed called the Gay Liberation Front, a political organization. Let's go to the meeting. And I was like, because I'd spent my 23 years doing my best that no one could read my mind. And I just froze. And I said, what do you mean? He said, let's go to this meeting. I said, what do you mean? He said, oh, come on, you're gay.
Oh, gosh. Oh, my goodness.
But I went. I was terrified and met this incredible group of men and women and what would now be called transgender, that, I mean, there might have been 30 people, 40 people that had the willingness to create an organization that was willing to try to what seemed absolutely an impossible task at the time. Because if we had 25 people at a demonstration because, say, NYU wouldn't allow the students to have a same-sex dance or a sit-in, I mean, no, you could not imagine that there would be million people for a, quote, gay pride parade one day. I mean, this was 1970. I mean, it's unimaginable. There's one photo of these meetings, and I mean, there might be 25 or 30 people sitting in a church basement. It would have been unimaginable, not to mention, I mean, same-sex marriage, or of course now there's a huge backlash in the United States, but that was also, perhaps we were naively could not imagine that. But so I spent the next couple of years, 2.5 years with these people. 10 of us lived together in a loft. And basically all that we did all day was have discussions, go to demonstrations. People created newspapers. We had dances. I had my first boyfriend. So there was a huge amount of benefit for me in learning to accept myself. And I still have about 5, 6, 7 friends, really good friends from that time, who really, just like the people in the mental hospital, extremely intelligent, creative, passionate activists. Yet the part of me that still suffered from depression, anxiety, whether it's a genetic tendency in me, a strong personality trait, who knows, that yes, I had activity, friendship. I felt I was making a difference in the world, but it was not starting to heal and resolved. It was a part, but it wasn't sufficient. Even though we even had what was called consciousness raising groups and small groups where we'd really talk about ourselves and deepen friendships and try to understand our place in the greater culture or political surrounding. So, I mean, and there the assumption was that the problem was patriarchy, and there's the men ruling the world. There's certainly there's truth in it, but I don't think it's the whole truth. In Cuba, the assumption was the problem was capitalism and how society was organized. A core group of us from the Gay Liberation Front in 1972 decided to move to San Francisco because that was supposed to be where it was happening, even though we didn't quite know. It was sort of the it was happening part was maybe the mid 60s. When we got there, the group didn't stay together. My boyfriend left me, and I was basically alone in a city where I knew no one. And the strong tendencies that had not been healed, particularly toward depression and anorexia, I became just like my mother. I went down to 120 pounds. But at the same time, I was meeting people in the world of holistic health, yoga, Tai Chi, that what nutrition makes a difference in our health. And sort of a turning point was there was an activist in the anti-Vietnam War movement, Rennie Davis. He just died in the last year or so. If your listeners have seen the film on Netflix about the Chicago 7, he was one of the defendants that the government accused of the riot, of having instigated the riots in Chicago during the Democratic Convention in 1968, rather than that the police attacked the demonstrators. And so I saw, I guess, a flyer. That was how information was conveyed. Flyers on lampposts were the internet of the time, or in the alternative newspapers, that Rennie Davis was going to give a speech at the University of Berkeley. And so here was someone who had been one of the presidents of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, one of the huge influential figures of the New Left, and of the assumption that changing the political system would heal humanity. And of course, that's true. If you have laws that you can't be fired for being Black or gay or being paid less as a woman, it's hugely important. I'm not diminishing it. Yet, what Rennie Davis pointed out, and it was kind of the first time I really heard this articulated, was that if changing the political system, which had been done in Russia, in Cuba, in China, for the whole history of the planet, would make this a better planet and a better world, maybe it would have happened by this time. And Rennie Davis said he was quitting the anti-war movement. The war was still going on at that time. And he was going to learn to meditate with this guru boy. He was 14 years old at the time. We called him the 14-year-old guru. And people, just as you were describing about the blame toward Aaron, people were screaming at him. The room was packed. He was very, very famous because he had been on trial in Chicago. He was a huge influence in the New Left. People were screaming at him for quitting and just being self-centered. It was a real turning point for me because I recognized, like, I've done this political activism, anti-war, Gay Liberation Front. I've been to Cuba. It's really important, and I'm still suffering. What can I do about this? And to make a long story short, a few years later, there was a therapy very popular at that time called primal therapy. Supposition was that you could re-experience childhood or even infant or in the womb trauma And by re-experiencing it, it would fundamentally alter all our adult patterns, developed by a therapist named Arthur Janoff. And I did that. And in a way, it was very beneficial because, particularly as a man, I had never been allowed to cry and scream and really experience the suffering of my childhood. At the same time, after a year or two, it became, now it's 4 o'clock and I'm going over there to cry and scream. Now, Rajneesh, now called Osho, that was one of the techniques he incorporated in this, probably his most well-known meditation called dynamic meditation. 10 minutes of it was crying and screaming consciously.
This is kind of overlapping with the growth of transcendental meditation at the same time as well.
Yeah, which was very different. I mean, that was just repeating a mantra.
Right. But there's a lot of Eastern influences, I feel, coming through at this point.
Particularly in San Francisco, where I was living. So I had this whole smorgasbord of possibilities. But because I had already done several years of primal therapy, because I'd done lots of deep body work, Rolfing, Reichian therapy, which the theory is that the trauma is stored in our bodies, and shaking and crying and screaming is beneficial. But there's still this assumption you can kind of get it out. I would say currently, from my current point of view, it's just reinforcing. There's benefit, and yet it can come just to reinforce and indulge in the pattern of identifying with the suffering. So a woman I knew, I can remember this moment, said to me, I went to this meditation and they were crying and screaming, what we called primaling at the time from primal therapy. They were primaling. So everything, you know, if you go to a yoga class, TM, any meditation I'd been introduced to, and there is a whole smorgasbord of possibilities in San Francisco, it had to do with you being calm, but I wasn't calm at all. I was depressed and 30 pounds underweight and starving myself with all these so-called healthful diets and fasting. And something really was appealing about this dynamic meditation. So that this was Rajneesh's kind of signature quote meditation. I would disagree now that it's meditation, but it's part of his experimental approach, which I appreciated because I'd already been through all these experiments.
And it was a buzzword at the time. So you're hearing meditation and you're thinking, okay.
It was 10 minutes of deep breathing, pranayama breathing, they call it breath of fire. 10 minutes of yelling and crying and screaming, 10 minutes of jumping with your arms up, shouting, hoo, 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 15 minutes of freezing silence, 15 minutes of dancing wildly and chaotically, and then lying down on the floor. And it really felt like for the first time in my life, I'm somewhat relaxed. Not for the first time. I had experienced that in yoga class. Yeah, yoga was huge also for me, that I could start to relax for the first time. So all this is beneficial, but it was really because of attending and then seeing people wandering around San Francisco dressed in red that I decided I would go to India. But I also can see the assumption was finally there was someone who could save me. The pitfalls of a hierarchical movement with a charismatic guru. Now we're into the subject, I guess, for our discussion, you know. So yeah, so that's a big, I would say it was a big assumption, unexamined assumption of Rajneesh.
And aside from traveling to various parts of America and over to South America at this point, you haven't traveled to anywhere like India before?
No, I'd been in Europe several summers to learn French.
I think it's really interesting what you've said about how some things resonated with you because of your previous experiences. So it could have easily been something like attack therapy or transcendental meditation, if you'd have had different experiences before meeting a group of sannyasins, kind of, as you mentioned, walking around with the various colors in San Francisco.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I'm going to assume that many people in the Rajneesh movement had similar experiences that led them to this. They were, if I had to generalize, extremely intelligent, extremely creative. Now, some of them had been extremely successful financially or in business. That was not true for me, but there were a lot of there was an emphasis on not talking about your past. So I don't know. I only know the people I know now who I've remained friends with. But certainly I'm assuming that everybody who was attracted to that movement came either from immense suffering or the suffering coming from the understanding of, is this all there is in life? And there must be something more, and some genuine longing for, and and there's a certain kind of personalities that are, not everyone is like that. There are people who are not introspective, and this might be a time. So I went to India.
Yes, and I'm hoping that you can paint this picture for us, because you arrive in 1977, and I would like to know where the ashram is up to at this point. How established is it? What does the Rajneesh movement look like? How is the LGBT community received? And what is India like for you visiting? So really just kind of run with as much detail as you want and paint this whole picture for us.
The movement was not as small as it had been when he was living in Bombay a few years previously, where he was living in an apartment complex and a couple of people at a time would visit him. At the same time, it was not anywhere near as huge as it came to be.
Okay, so 1977 is pretty early on then in terms of the size that the Rajneesh movement would grow to.
Yeah, but obviously there were enough people who had gone and come and like in San Francisco, that I would meet them if I were in a certain slice of yoga, holistic health therapy. I would also say, yes, I was living in San Francisco in a huge Victorian center for what was called postural integration, which was developed by a psychologist who had studied with Ida Rolf, who posit that very deep body work could not only help structurally align the body, but emotionally, psychologically help others. And I found that very beneficial. And there I was also meeting people from all over the world, including my friend Jason, who I mentioned before, who invited me to my first GLF meeting, was living there. So I would say at its best, Rajneesh brought together all those beneficial, although I would say currently sometimes questionable assumptions and therapies. He attracted extremely intelligent and creative, lots of artists. We had a Shakespeare company that I was in, where I was the only American with all these I learned more about Shakespeare from being in that company than I never learned in school.
Wow.
Who had been really in the high levels of British theater. I had a tremendous sense of community and belonging. Because of his iconoclastic personality, he attracted similar people who were willing to engage in a lot of experimentation. All these post-Freudian experimental therapies and group processes were there that had been brought from the Esalen Institute in California. Primal therapy, rebirthing, Reichian therapy, breath work, all kinds of massage. I did massage there. I learned a lot about massage there, and the body-mind connections. So Emerson, he attracted very open-minded and experimental. I mean, in terms of theater, I initiated a production of Waiting for Godot that we performed out in the middle of a sugarcane field with this vast, starry Indian sky above lit by maybe kerosene lamps with highly educated audience, because Rajneesh, had been giving lectures about Waiting for Godot, which indeed is profound.
So it sounds very similar to how Nicola described the beauty around the community that was being built. In the 70s, though, I mean, there were a few other notable groups around that time that had that same almost essence of utopia at one point before things shifted and changed. And it's always the community that is spoken about in that way. You know, Jim Jones and the People's Temple, when the move to Guyana was made, the individuals talking about building that community, they say that they were building their own utopia. And I hear it so much with these, and it gives me goosebumps when they say that this community was one of the best things that they'd ever experienced. And that's what the promise was of the group and the movement until things take a darker turn.
Longing, I believe, in at least some of us, to belong to a community where we would help each other and support each other and learn from each other, and everything was done absolutely beautifully. And I had always wanted to go to India. There was a no internet and very little television. There was a famous documentary film by the French director Louis Malle called Phantom India. It was 7-part, I believe, documentary about India. Now, of course, there's gazillions that are available, but that it was not available. And I was just riveted. There was something, are there past lives? I don't know. Why was I attracted to yoga? But there was something about being in India that was thrilling.
When you were involved in theatre and then when you were involved with the GLF, you said that you felt like you'd found some type of connection community, but you still felt a sense of longing, a sense of something missing. Did you feel like that had finally been filled, that hole or that sense of searching within yourself?
I thought, which is different than felt, because had I been more self-aware, perhaps, I would have again noticed what was missing in terms of learning real skills to deal with change, trauma, intellectual, interpersonal relationships, and all the challenges that we as humans face. But there certainly was. I mean, I don't know. I describe him now as probably a brilliant sociopath. He had been a professor of philosophy. He could talk for hours on any Eastern or Western religious tradition and on the Western philosophers, sprinkled with lots of humor and iconoclastic, provocative observations. And his provocations against, established religion and established political systems certainly fit with all the 60s he was the perfect person for that time, compared, you could say, to Transcendental Meditation or the Hare Krishna movement, which were, in comparison, relatively staid introductions of Hinduism. Here was this big mishmash of all these various Eastern meditation techniques and thought-provoking commentary. I mean, very provocative and thought-provoking he could be. But I didn't also necessarily have the critical skills nor the past education to know if all his descriptions of when he was talking about Zen or Hinduism or Islam were actually accurate or not. There was a lot of dance and music, and which, having come from a rigid 1950s environment, I would say is beneficial in, Reich's assertion that all this trauma and rigidity is held in our body. A lot of stimulus, of course, from being in India and traveling, questioning orthodoxy. He had expression Zorba the Buddha, so that, it was meant to be the image of we could be fully engaged and creative and expressive and dancing, and at the same time aware of some longing for a bigger dimension.
Yeah, I feel like with the genius that the man was, he threw so much at the wall and, it would stick. So can you talk us through the first time you saw Rajneesh himself?
You could say no sooner had I arrived. Now his, what they call discourses, lectures, used to be printed, were both in books and in a newspaper format or large magazine format. So no sooner did I arrive than I saw that one of his discourses, he said that there were these stages of sexual development I mean, I'm guessing it sounded kind of Hindu or Freudian mixture of, and that homosexuality was, you could say, I guess maybe that's a Freudian view, a sort of occasional teenage impulse, occasional teenage that some people, but that basically, particularly I think, there's all the symbolism in Hinduism from about the, and in I mean, how it's interpreted in Chinese medicine, the yin and the yang, and they have symbols of phallic symbols and vaginal symbols in the artwork and in the philosophy, and that somehow that's how the universe fits together, which of course now I would say most educated people would see there's this huge variety of human experience. And so he said something like this. So when I had my first one-on-one meeting, there might have been, so they would have these nightly, they called them darshan. The idea was not just to talk, but there was some experiential transmission of his, quote, perfect enlightenment, his perfection, his attainment. But having read this, I went in there like this. And apparently, because all these interviews were published, the woman who wrote the commentary in that particular book said people really usually didn't talk to him like that.
Wow. Okay.
He was the big cheese.
Yeah, yeah.
But I was used to talking to people like that because I'd been in this confrontational
activism space. Absolutely.
Gay Liberation Front, like the Gay Liberation Front, when the Archbishop of New York said something against homosexuality, we demonstrated in front of St. Paul's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue with signs such as "God is gay" and "The church is the real perversion." And so I was used to, well, the same level of provocation that he demonstrated, advocated his provocation against traditional Hinduism, against the Christians in Oregon, for example. So I was very comfortable with that. And I said, I read in this article that you thought there were these stages of sexual development, and I disagree. The room kind of went, because people didn't talk to him like that. Now he had this manner of everything was even keel. Now I saw the rip in that fabric about 8 years later in Oregon, but that's another story. And he said, "Do you want to become a sannyasin?" Which was a follower, a disciple. And I said, "No." And he said, "Good, you're not ready. I wouldn't let you anyway," or something like that. "You're not ready." And now he was an expert at saying different things on different days, theoretically, to get people to really think and engage in critical thinking. That's to give him the benefit of the doubt. So on other, there certainly were gay couples there, and, you could find other, quote, discourses he gave where he said, God never makes mistakes and you're absolutely perfect the way you are. But of course, I was used to being defensive and hearing criticism. So I went off, but I really enjoyed the people and being there and being India itself. It was so exotic compared to 50s suburban America. I mean, it wouldn't matter where you went or where you turned your head. There was something so radically mind-boggling different about India than 50s America that I didn't want to leave. And I liked the people. So I said to myself, because the assumption was, unless you are a disciple, a sannyasin, unless you thoroughly throw yourself into this, you will never experience what I have to offer. And you can't do it from the outside. And of course, since I was used to already throwing myself into lots of, going to Cuba, the gay liberation, starving myself in the name of healthful fasting or whatever, that I probably have this extremist personality, I thought, okay, I'll do it. And so the second time I saw him, and when I was, you're about pre-COVID, about a foot away from his face, he certainly had some kind of charismatic, hypnotic something. That doesn't mean that he was necessarily a compassionate person, but maybe it's a quality skill that some people have. There was something significantly about being a foot from his face than being, excuse me, in front of your face.
Yeah. Well, Erin Robbins and Nicola Ranson have both said the same thing. Nicola's first face-to-face interaction with him was extremely powerful.
Yeah. And so I will just assume that there are people who can generate energetic, charismatic magnetism, and now I took it to mean that therefore, because that he was enlightened, had attained this level of perfect wisdom or something. Now, from a Buddhist point of view, there is no such thing as permanence, and we like to use the term enlightening in our Zen practice, that there's this gradual maturation rather than some endpoint of perfection. But that's what this term enlightenment designates, some endpoint, perfect finish line, and that and that was the assumption that only by being in his Buddha field, his energy field, and surrendering and being in his either very proximal or close presence would something magical sudden occur. And I was desperate for that because of my history of depression and anxiety. And I enjoyed the creativity. We had a very provocative cabaret theater group where we made fun. I don't know, there might have been 10 of us. We made fun of everything around the ashram. We would satirize everything. And so we made up funny songs. I could sing one if you want that I still remember.
I'd love that.
Okay. So this was in our cabaret. And at that time, Sheila, who became infamous, and other women from the office, they came to our cabarets. They laughed, they enjoyed themselves. It was part of this iconoclastic, provocative, artistic scene that existed there. So this little bit from the cabaret went, oy vey, you'd say oy vey too, if your son ran off with a Schwarzer guru. That is a black-skin guru. He cleans public toilets without any pay. Oy vey, near what the neighbors will say. Oy vey, you'd say oy vey too, if your son ran off with a Schwarzer guru, etc. Like that. So then one of the first rips in the fabric, you could say, was we're sitting in one of these 2-hour morning discourses, and he says, I hear that these people are making fun of me. This has to stop. And it stopped. It came to a crashing halt. And I, who was used to saying what I thought, did not. I didn't leave because where was I going to go in the world? I didn't say, I mean, yes, among each other, like, this is like, we're not really making fun of him, you know. Well, we had a little, in the skit, we had a little baby carriage with a teddy bear, and everybody was bowing and scraping to the baby carriage with the teddy bear, for example. And it was that kind of satire, which he excelled in, because he used to talk about the Prime Minister of India drinking his own pee. He made fun of Mahatma Gandhi. He loved to ridicule.
But he didn't want to be ridiculed, which is interesting, because if he claims to be enlightened, then why is there some type of ego coming through there? That's
I couldn't make that connection.
Wow. So you have cognitive dissonance, just kind of like.
Another thing is that I had been, because my mother and her volunteerism, when I was in San Francisco, I'd done daycare. I was and the political activism, the anti-war, the GLF, Gay Liberation Front, I was very accustomed. And when I got there, I said, well, is there any outreach to the Indian community? There's a huge amount of poverty, or we could teach people to read. What can we do? I said, no, you are not here to do anything for other people. You are here for yourself, because your life isn't working. You are here to surrender to the guru. And if you want to go do social work, you can leave and go do it somewhere else. Now, that didn't sit right, but I didn't leave. I was so desperate to belong. Now, he would also talk about the Georgian teacher, George Gurdjieff. Part of Gurdjieff's teaching, ideally to show students their attachments, was he'd say, dig a trench, and 3 days later, now fill it in, and things. So there was this arbitrariness about the ashram, where here I was, I said, we had the Shakespeare Company, feel blessed to be with these British, really intelligent people who had been in the Royal Shakespeare Company, blah, blah, traveling around India. I was thrilled. And there was this just arbitrary, no, you're done. You're not going to be in the theater company. You're going to clean toilets now. And there was no discussion. And yes, you can take it that, but currently that's not a teaching system that I would choose to think is beneficial. For someone who had had as much challenge as I had to be in something that was creative, building friendships, and be told, no, it's finished, you're over, you're going to go scrub the floor with a toothbrush now. Not because the floor needs it, just because you're going to learn about your attachment.
So what do you think the purposes were behind those decisions? Is it like, because my mind jumps straight to how some people in leaderships in high demand groups they'll flex their position of power by pairing people together, ripping up marriages.
Exactly. Only they know.
So you actually stay in India for 5 years.
Correct.
You are given a mala from Rajneesh himself.
Yeah, which was considered him placing that on my neck, incredible honor. So there was this assumption that he had attained that, and that it was humanly possible to attain, which is not an assumption I make now, this permanent state of so-called enlightenment, and that it was transmissible from him to thousands of others as long as one was a disciple and stayed in this Buddha field and surrendered. That is, if I was asked to leave the theater group and scrub floors with a toothbrush, and that's what you were, and you're right, that to what degree, yes, there's something I might learn about attachment and how suffering comes from being attached to having things my way. And at the same time, to what degree is this people in power cementing their power with showing others that they're the ones who have the power.
Right.
Now, going back to this idea that from the GLF, Gay Liberation Front assumption, the problem with the world was patriarchy. So Rajneesh was aware of this, and but the assumption became, if women ran the world, then the world would be a better place. And women ran the organization. Yet, yes, men and women are conditioned differently, probably have certainly have physiological differences, and we don't know how to slice and dice that yet. But I can tell you, Nicola could, just because women ran the organization, of course, with his background input, did not mean that there was any less
corruption, abuse, exploitation.
Right. So another assumption out the window that, because he wouldn't choose me, he wouldn't choose Nicola, he would choose women who were gifted in running large organizations and used to, more assertive personality.
And this is kind of where more of that genius comes in. And you don't often want to use that word in a way that praises an individual who really exploited his position of power. So where he positions to you that women are the way to change the world and make the world a better place, the way that he is able to explain his agenda behind all of these decisions in a way that makes sense to people in whatever position they are in, it really is a stroke of genius, but of course meant that he was able to basically exploit every single person that followed him, whether it was financially, sexually, spiritually.
Now, the question, of course, is, and we'll never know because he's not alive to write his memoirs, and would he be honest anyway, is to what degree I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt that when he began realizing that he had, I'm going to assume that he had a genuine, he recognized his ability as a charismatic leader and a genuine ability to want to help others. That's theoretically the purpose of being a teacher, guru, or something. And to what degree he consciously manipulated and to what degree he allowed himself to be manipulated, we're never going to know. But it was certainly, obviously, just the fact of calling someone a guru is a leader-centered. Now, in GLF, in the Gay Liberation Front, people criticize it for being an anarchic, unleaderless organization. Of course, you had fewer people, but that's another way to run an organization. With Castro and communism, obviously central leadership, and with the United States, some mixture of chaos and leadership. But in GLF, if people wanted to do something, they just did it. They want to start a newspaper, they want to start a health center, they want to have a discussion group, they just did it. And it was more that way in India. Like, some friends and I had this idea, let's do Waiting for Godot. He's talking about it. Let's do it out in the sugarcane field. And so there was a lot bigger umbrella in India for people to engage their creativity. Once the organization moved to Oregon, now you had a super tightly controlled leader centered between Bhagwan and Sheila. Bhagwan was the name he took. Bhagwan Rajneesh is what we called him at the time. Now you had and we were isolated in the desert, tightly controlled, and you did exactly what you were told, or you left. The implicit threat was, if you leave, you would miss out on this extraordinary opportunity. And he would say these things like, only once in 2,500 years, like, no one had existed like him since the time of the Buddha. So to leave was to risk, in Christian terms, damnation or lack of salvation.
So did Rajneesh give you a new name?
Yes.
What was the name that he chose for you?
Well, did he choose it? Who knows? Now, that was another assumption, that he chose every name and has a special insight into your unique personality or
Oh no, don't say that there's like a sheet of paper and he was just reading off random names to people.
Who knows? We don't know. We'll
Because
never know.
apparently that's what a Sung Myung Moon would do with his mass weddings. He would literally just pair people together, throw bits of paper together, and say that God has told him that these two people belong together to move the world into the place of perfection that it's supposed to be in. But in fact, was actually just saying you and you and you and you.
So like the name, yeah, so who knows? The name he gave me was Puneet, which means purity in either Hindi or Sanskrit. And do I have a perfectionistic, purist streak in me? Absolutely. So that, and then would give a little talk when he'd give you the name and put this necklace mala on your neck. And he said, you've been just traveling on the circumference. You've been fasting and doing yoga and doing chanting meditation or doing political activism or psychotherapy. And this is all in the circumference. And in the center is your divine purity, Deva Puneet. That's your name. And you're here to discover this essential divine purity. I like the name Puneet. My close friends still call me Puneet. It's just, to me, it's like a nickname. It's not, I don't associate it with him and all the catastrophic events that occurred. There was certainly a hierarchy in this assumption. The people who were there first were more special, but maybe the people who came a year or two after me thought I was more special.
So you're in India for 5 years. Are you aware of the move to Oregon? Because it was all kind of done underhanded, very secret.
No, one day after one of these discourses, he got in the car and left. I mean, of course he'd been. And I believe I saw that car go out and we're going, because, he had maybe one or two.
I was going to say, was it a Rolls Royce?
Well, it was just one or two in India. And he left, but I don't remember what the explanation was at the time. Someone would remember that. And I didn't know where was I going to go in the world. I'd been there 5 years. And I had heard that it was very beautiful in Sri Lanka. It was less crowded, less impoverished than India. The beaches were beautiful. This was before the catastrophe of the civil wars and the current economic collapse, although there had been inter-religious strife. But so I went to Sri Lanka, and yes, it was beautiful, but I once again was thrown back on myself, and I recognized all the unhealed pain, and I didn't know what to do in the world. And I met people a lot of Western from Europe come to Sri Lanka to study Vipassana, Southeast Asian mindfulness, Buddhist meditation. And these same people said, you want to go up in the mountains, there's this exorcism ceremony. And it was like the pre-Hindu and pre-Buddhist indigenous religious tradition of Sri Lanka. Drumming, chaotic dancing, dancers in indigenous Sri Lankan costumes, skirts, elaborately painted masks. And someone gave me some acid, LSD. And it seemed to me that they were dancing about me and all my unhealed pain, that I was greedy, that I was suffering, that I wasn't relaxed, that I didn't know what to do in the world. And it profoundly affected me. So we stayed up all night watching this indigenous dancing, some kind of exorcism of this old woman that they put in the middle of the circle. And I remembered these people who said they had gone to this Vipassana center and they just sat still for 5 or 10 days, watching their breath and their body and their thoughts. And I thought I could never do that, but a part of me thought I have to learn to do that. So I did.
Oh my gosh, 5 to 10 days, Ron, that's crazy.
Well, I stayed longer. I think I stayed 3 or 4 months, 3, 4, 5 months. I don't remember.
That is such a wild amount of time.
It was my first introduction to my current, what's called now in America, mindfulness practice, mindfulness Buddhist Vipassana practice. And that's this very although there are assumptions with religious Buddhism also about enlightenment and this kind of somehow permanent state of perfection or realization, it's a very different approach. Because what I saw around the Rajneesh ashram is the association with meditation was you should be calm and even better, blissful. A lot of talk about bliss. And I wasn't calm or blissful, but I did see in this first introduction in Sri Lanka that it was paradoxically possible to become calmer and more comfortable in myself by watching the chaos. Bhagwan talked a lot about being the witness. It was a lot of intellectual construct, and there were short groups, and there may have been people there who learned that, but I did not learn that in India. I mean, it's a lifetime of learning, and it's a certain assumption about a certain approach that we can sit with ourselves no matter how we are without being result oriented, being blissful or calm, and watch and experience our lack of calm, like right now, my fear about where am I going to live and what's going to happen to me and how that feels in my body. And I mean, that is not, so that's what I meant at the beginning, that I believe underneath all the gilded, beautiful talk and theater and excitement and externalities of the Rajneesh movement, I didn't learn real tools for taking care of myself and all this leader-centered. So you could say either he or the organization took advantage of a genuine aspiration in the people who were there to learn and mature. Because does it really make sense? I mean, if it were as easy as I could impart to you my life experience just by talking about it, or through some direct transmission, life would be easier, but it's not. And I think also the Buddhist movements in the United States and in Europe have grown up a lot from being centered around charismatic leaders to this is a hard lifetime practice of having the discipline to sit down with ourselves every day, partially for the purpose of being aware throughout our whole day of how we are with other people. Are we speaking kindly? Are we acting kindly? So when I had to leave Sri Lanka, I went back to St. Louis and I lived with my mother, who was really severely disabled by that time. Spent a significant amount of her day washing her hands and starving herself. But the benefit of having been in the Rajneesh community was that I met other people in the group in St. Louis, and I had some friendship and some sense of purpose and belonging, even though from my current point of view, a little bit still with these assumptions that if I was upset, I could release it and get it out and it would be over with this dancing. And so as the community in India, in Oregon started to enlarge, and I think particularly as now we know this crucial vote was coming up in the fall of 1984, in the November election of 1984, about whether Rajneeshpuram could be incorporated as a city. Their purpose in bringing all these homeless people to Oregon and in suddenly saying, doors are wide open, come from St. Louis. We want as many people as possible. They wanted my vote. Now the legislature in Oregon put that to a crashing halt, but that's why I went to Oregon at the time I did. They wanted my vote, now I understand.
At the point you arrive in Oregon and the community is somewhat established, what is your role within Rajneeshpuram or Rancho Rajneesh?
So that infrastructure had been built and they now had enough prefab trailers and whatnot for people like myself to come. And the more people that came, then the more infrastructure and services you needed. So for quite a while, I worked in a warehouse where, you needed to bring that many sheets, did inventory, and that many pillowcases and this many boxes of hand soap. All the arts and creative expression that I had enjoyed in India was gone. And it was just work, and it was 7 days a week.
Wow, so super regimented at this point.
Yes, absolutely. But with this assumption that you are now in the isolated Buddha field, so that I'm as foolish as it now may seem, I'm waiting for something to happen where I wouldn't be as depressed and anxious any longer. Now, I'm not saying everybody there had the same depression and anxiety as I had. I don't know. But I was certainly there for the hope and community, and the hope that something would significantly shift psychologically. And after all, this was by now 7 to 8 years of my life that this was all I knew. So it certainly still gave me a sense of purpose and community and belonging. Then, as you know, within year and a quarter, as was documented in Wild Wild Country on Netflix, the documentary, all these catastrophic collapses started to occur. From my point of view, there was even more than was in that documentary.
I didn't know if you wanted to speak to any of that, because there wasn't much known about the children within Rancho Rajneesh. There wasn't much known about the standing of children. So not just where the children were and why there weren't any in the documentary, but also what the thoughts and feelings were around children within the movement. Because the homeless people that were promised all of the things that everybody else was promised, as well as shelter and food, community, a safe place to live. Of course, it's problematic in terms of inviting predators and abusers into the environment, as you're doing with any type of community. But then to prey on that community that are in need of food and shelter, and then turf them out when the vote's not going through.
No, I wasn't asked to leave just because the vote was essentially the legislature said no. I mean, at that point in Oregon, I think if you had been a resident for a month or something, you could vote in an Oregon election. And they just threw that out before the November election. This was when Reagan was elected president for the second time. Oregon had some of the strictest land use laws in the country, if not the strictest, and environmental consciousness. And they weren't going to allow a city to be built on farmland, particularly a controversial one like that. Whether Sheila and the others were aware of that or just barged in, or whether they thought, like in India, if you just threw enough money at a problem, you could pay off the politicians, as in India, who knows? But it certainly wasn't from the beginning a pragmatic decision based on the law. And so the vote in November of '84 had something to do with allowing Rajneeshpuram to incorporate as a city. And that you could say that was another rip in my psychic fabric when I started to learn that the homeless were just being exported and dumped into various nearby cities, and even that a few died. It also turned out that I always wondered why they had a separate food line. It turned out that they had I guess it's a tranquilizer, Haldol, in their beer, put in their beer. So we were not allowed to go in their food line. So they were essentially drugging them to keep them calm.
That's creating so many different spheres of the kind of us versus them mentality, isn't it? Not just the hierarchical pyramid that exists within the movement at that point already.
I remember the moment when I said to someone in the warehouse, I said, this isn't right. We said we were bringing them here for humanitarian purposes. And the person turned to me and said, sort of similar to when I got to India and asking about social activism, if you knew how to run your life, you wouldn't be here. You are here to surrender, and everything is done for your spiritual growth. And it's just your attachment to things should be this way or shouldn't be that way. But I mean, a huge assumption I currently make, as I said, from Buddhism is that, am I making compassionate choices, kind choices? And that's my framework. But it wouldn't matter if it's Buddhism or Christian. Do I want to be remembered as someone who benefited others or not? And this was, yes, you could say they were homeless. They had nowhere to go back to anyway. But in November, just dump them somewhere after they'd been promised food, shelter, and therapy, it definitely didn't sit well with me. Then, as you know, Bhagwan tried to flee the country in a small jet. I mean, there had already been numerous falsehoods about him coming here for his back pain, which wasn't true. And I mean, he may have had back pain, but he was coming here to establish a new community. So when it appeared he was going to be arrested for immigration fraud and other charges, he tried to flee the country. He was captured in North Carolina. He was headed for Bermuda, apparently. So I remember the evening. So this was obviously shocking. And prior to that, Sheila and this 10 or 15 other women had fled the community. We'll go back a month or so. When it appeared they were going to be arrested, most of them were arrested and many went to prison. Now he had not been talking, he had not been in public. He actually came out for the first time. And I remember expecting that there would be this hugely empathic response from a compassionate leader, that this must be incredibly upsetting to find that your leadership has fled, that they're being accused of all these crimes and wiretapping and racketeering and attempted murder. Instead, he in person up there on the stage was blaming Sheila for everything and then complaining because we the worker bees were very upset. I hear people are not going to work and the bakery is shut down and you should be working. And what's wrong? What's wrong with you? I mean, this occurred. And that was just like, what? There's no allowance for us to be upset that our whole life has been, in French, they say, and then he tried to flee. And Ted Koppel, who was a very famous newscaster at the time, had a show at an evening newscast called Nightline, went into the prison in North Carolina. This was surprisingly not in the Wild Wild Country documentary. I don't know why. Surely this footage must exist somewhere, or maybe it was destroyed. Ted Koppel, one of the most famous news broadcasters in the country, went into the prison to interview him. And I still naively remember thinking, here, now America is going to be exposed to his genius. He speaks so beautifully. His hands move so lovingly. His expressions are so precise. Instead, he looked like any other prisoner, the way I'd been when I was 18 years old, locked up in the mental hospital in a jumpsuit, speaking chaotically. He looked awful without the jewels and the beautiful robes and the cars and the grooming and the makeup. It was this rambling, chaotic nonsense. And that was like, wow. Yet still I didn't leave. Where was I going to go? So he came back to the community, to the commune. And there was this was also not in the Netflix documentary. I don't know why. So we had been very isolated, without newspapers, without seeing journalists. They had a very tiny engagement with the outside world where people could come in and tour the community, like I guess doing to North Korea. It's all controlled, A friend of mine used to be the tour guide on that bus where outsiders could come in. They called them Twinkies. She had to leave the community. She did leave because she was physically becoming ill from lying about what was going on there to outsiders. So they had a news conference after he came back from prison. He was in prison for 2 weeks. They were working out a plea bargain for him to leave the country. He came back. They had this gigantic news conference. There were hundreds of journalists. It was the first time in a year I'd seen significant number of outside the commune people. There were cameras, lights. He was up on the marble dais with his beautiful robes and jewelry. And he was blaming Sheila, and it was all her fault. And he had been in isolation and silence and meditation for years. He didn't know anything about the wiretapping, the attempted murder, the racketeering, the immigration fraud, the purchase of weapons. It was all Sheila. It was all her fault. That's why she had fled. That's why she was in jail. And this journalist, and we never heard people speak to him, this journalist got up and said, "Mr. Rajneesh, do you know that many people here do not believe you?" The room went silent. Nobody talked back to him. And he said, and now this fits so in with my family history of Nazism, "Everybody here either believes me or believes in me. Everybody who believes me or believes in me, raise your hand and say yes 3 times." And there was this stunned silence. I remember looking to my left, looking to my right, and I wasn't going to be the outsider. And the whole auditorium goes, "Yes, yes, yes." Inside, what have I done? This is just like Germany. What have I done? And we knew it, because that night we were joking about it. We would be in the townhouses where we live and we'd say, "Casey, do you want to wash the dishes tonight? Raise your hand and say yes 3 times." We knew this had been the moment. I do not understand why that was not in the documentary. Then people started to leave, and all these revelations and allegations started to come out. I remember several years later meeting someone in Amsterdam who said he had been the courier from Amsterdam to India. I would go to Europe every year because my father lived in Belgium. He had been the courier for what he called extremely addictive painkillers, what we might call opiates now, from India to from Europe to India. A guy who used to live around the corner from me in San Diego said he had been the courier for the laughing gas. He drove the van from Bhagwan's house down to Portland. They'd refill the canisters with laughing gas. On the way, they would get stoned on a little bit of laughing gas that was left in the canisters, and they'd deliver full canisters back. So these are personal discoveries I made. And as you know, the other thing that's well known is that hundreds of people were sickened through poisoning of restaurants with salmonella in nearby towns in Bend and the Dalles. And so obviously this was hugely traumatic, because this organization that I'd put years of my life into, and yet in the long run, it was beneficial, because I discovered in San Diego the 2 currents where I've actually learned tools, which are nonviolent communication, which have to do with our internal and external communication, and the way our Zen practice, our mindfulness practice, Vipassana practice is taught here. And as you know, to reiterate, for me, that was somewhat missing, the conscious learning of tools that would help myself and others.
Well, you spent so much of your early life searching for that I was so worried we'd get to the end of the episode and you'd say that you still hadn't found what it was, because you can't go through all of those things you went through and still never find something that brings you a level of peace.
Sometimes, and I also recognize that for better or worse, whether it's genetic or culturally learned, I have a strong tendency toward anxiety and depression, and that I have no choice to engage with and use these tools. But I recognize I'm not the only one. I want to highly recommend, for example, a podcast called 10% Happier, where all kinds of English-speaking Buddhist teachers, psychologists, social workers, and authors are interviewed. They're really talking about real tools for people to mature. And I also want to recommend the skills that are taught in this system called nonviolent communication, which is very pragmatic tools for deepening in our relationships with other people and ourselves. That's what I was looking for my whole life.
Oh my goodness, Ron, what an incredible life experience you've had. Oh my goodness, you could write 10 books about every major chapter of your life that we've just briefly touched on throughout this episode. I just think that's absolutely, I mean, we've kind of skipped to the last part where I ask you what advice you would give to others. You've listed a few things there around some techniques that you would use, some podcasts that you'd recommend. I'm kind of personally just interested in your story of how you met Nicola, when you met her in your journey, and what your kind of journey together looked like, because she put me in touch with you, and you're both obviously very empathetic, very beautiful souls, people that care very dearly about the other people around them and the wellness of other people and the wellness of the environments that we exist in as well, not just the people. So I just wondered if you could talk us through how you both made that connection.
I don't remember the moment I met her, but it's a wonderful example of the best part. I mean, one of the best parts of the Rajneesh community was these lifelong friendships that were formed. And of course, Nicola and I also had this background in theater, live theater. And Nicola's background in somatic experiencing, which is a type of trauma therapy that's very congruent with the way we do our mindfulness or Zen practice here at this particular Zen Center of San Diego. And others now, where there's a lot more awareness from somatic experiencing and other systems, that instead of kind of get it out and releasing emotion, which was the presumption of dynamic meditation, et cetera, and a lot of the cathartic therapies of the 70s, that we can sit and experience, we know what we're thinking, the content of what we're thinking, and how that feels in our body with curiosity. So that I'm doing my best right now as, I experience this challenge of having to find a new place to live after 33 years, when I have anxiety, to approach that with curiosity and caring, what is this like, rather than trying to push it away. To do our best to learn from whatever life presents, whether it's the fact that I'm in an older body, or obviously I have family and friends who are dying or sick, or whether you're just exhausted from having young children. Can you allow that as a learning experience? It's a very different mindset.
It is. And I feel like it would take lots of time and patience and willingness to want to change your mindset before you could allow yourself to do that.
Or desperation.
Desperation, yeah.
Also, certainty. I mean, to me, real leadership and real teachers demonstrate through their own example. They teach from their own experience. I think the best, of course, I'm in this world of Buddhist or Zen or mindfulness teachers, but teach from their own experience without presenting themselves as special, or the way Rajneesh did. So I like to joke that experience was how I learned what doesn't work.
We've talked about so much. I mean, we could have done an entire episode on a number of individuals whose names we've thrown out there. Adolf Hitler. You could talk about him as a cult leader. You could talk about Fidel Castro or Che Guevara, or even if you're going to talk about Che Guevara and him being from Argentina, you could even talk about Augustus Pinochet and the concentration camps of Chile and South America. You could talk about Mara Angelou as being a charismatic matriarch within the Rajneesh movement herself. I just feel like there's such a wealth of experience that you've had, and we could have just chosen any one of those names and done another conversation on one of those individuals. I suppose, personally sitting down with Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh is very different to those names we've thrown out. But I think that this has been such an incredible conversation. I never thought in my life that I would ever have the opportunity to speak to one of the original members of the Gay Liberation Front. I'm like talking to somebody that's literally changed history. That's incredible. I do not underestimate what that means and the significance that means, especially in the social, political, and religious climate in America at the moment, and all of the shifts and changes that are happening. I just think it's incredible.
Should you ever want to talk to 5 or 10 of us together?
I would love that. I would love that opportunity.
Because some of us are still alive, and there's, I personally still engage with, 5 or 10.
Oh my goodness. Yes, I'll email you about that after this session, because I think that would be amazing.
I do presentations, well, now because of the pandemic, by Zoom for San Diego Unified School District. And, we've done presentations in New York, live panels. And these are very articulate people, between the ages of 70 and 80, mostly. They're still many very, very engaged in their communities and would be delighted to share these.
That would be incredible. That would be incredible. We've had so many guests on the show that identify or ally themselves with the LGBTQIA plus community. And we talk so much about high demand religious groups and purity culture on this show, and how there has been no room for individuals to express themselves freely or to live a life where they identify openly in, the way that they feel inside, outwardly to everybody else. So I just
never got around back to, even in India, that was supposed to be the subject of our conversation, but it certainly was a predominantly, 95% heterosexual culture. And it reinforced, unfortunately for me at that time, that there was something wrong with me and other people were having fun. Now, obviously, we're learning a lot about how, particularly the women, were not having so much fun. And what appeared to be this open and free expression of sexuality was not so great for a significant number of people. I was pretty oblivious of that, other than being pretty isolated.
Yeah, but that's by design. They keep you so busy. They keep you involved with sessions and workshops and cleaning duties and rotas and hair sniffing and all the other things that happen, just in the ashram. This is before you get to the more regimented thing, that there is no time and space to think, it's all by design.
But there weren't that many LGBT people for me to engage with. But I had some good friendships, but it certainly was, you could say, as advertised, and it was only about 7 years after the Gay Liberation Front. So that would have been an extremely unusual for him, particularly coming from an Indian culture, to have openly welcomed and talked about.
Well, I suppose he'd found his brand and he'd found the things that worked for him. So maybe if that wasn't working, he would have made that his message around welcoming or encouraging the LGBT community to be, authentic to themselves, because maybe that message would have stuck. So you kind of just see going along to see what works, it
certainly didn't attract as more Westerners came, the Indians left. They didn't feel as welcome. And so the minority of LGBT Indians certainly wouldn't, by what they saw, would not have felt welcome there at all.
Well, thank you so much, Ron, for sitting down and talking with me. I know this is such a transitional time for you, and I appreciate that it's not always easy to sit down and reflect on things in life that have been traumatic. I don't underestimate that this has been a breeze to sit down and relive some of these experiences and talk about your parents and their experiences and you growing up in the world and your struggle to find where you fit, where you belong, your struggle with your sexuality and your identity, and all of those things that have come along with our conversation today. I deeply appreciate you coming here and opening up and allowing the listeners to listen to your experiences. I think it's, again, incredible to sit down with somebody who has changed history, and I can't thank you enough for your time. And I will definitely be hopefully sitting down with you and some others to have a conversation around the Gay Liberation Front and hearing some other incredible and empowering stories as well. So thank you so much for your time, Ron, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
Take care. I'll speak to you soon, Ron. Bye.
Bye.
That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.